Welcome, dear listeners, to another cozy Miss Marple mystery. Make yourself comfortable and let the story unfold. On a snowy Christmas morning, the village postmistress disappears, leaving Miss Marple a chilling clue. What secret hid beneath the snow? Where are you listening from tonight? It would make me happy to know where you're listening from. Are you safe tonight? I hope so. It's strange, isn't it? You and I, connected through a story. Are you in your room? Lights off. Good. Let's begin. I'm curious. How did you find this story? Tell us in the comments below. Snow had begun to fall early that December morning, soft and persistent, settling over Mary Mead like a blanket of quiet anticipation. The village was dressed for Christmas, wreaths hung on cottage doors, and holly sprigs peeked from window ledges. But there was an odd tension beneath the festive calm, a sense that something was not quite right. At precisely 8:30, Miss Marple drew back her lace curtains, teacup in hand, and noticed Mrs. Mary Finch, the postmistress, cycling past on her usual route, a neat woman in her 50s with rosy cheeks and a brisk manner. Miss Finch had been delivering letters for nearly 20 years, and not a soul in the village could recall her ever missing a morning. Yet, there was something unusually hurried about her manner today, as though she wished to be anywhere but where she was. By noon, the snowfall had thickened. Villagers sought warmth in their parlors and kitchens, fires crackling as carols played faintly on the wireless. The vicar's wife was preparing for the church bazaar. Miss Price Ridley was criticizing the quality of mince pies at the grocer's, and Colonel Melchett was seen trudging toward the post office with a frown. Apparently a parcel meant for his niece had gone astray. But when young Tommy Hewitt, the butcher's boy, went to deliver a basket of goods to Mrs. Finch's cottage at the edge of the village, he found the door slightly ajar and the house empty. The fire had gone out. Her bicycle leaned against the wall, its tires crusted with snow. On the table sat a half-eaten breakfast, a letter opener beside a small stack of envelopes, one of them addressed curiously to Miss Jane Marple. By 4 o'clock, word had spread through the entire village. The postmistress had vanished. Mrs. Finch, who had never failed to deliver so much as a postcard, was gone without a trace. As the police arrived from Much Benham and began their search, speculation bloomed like frost on every window pane. Some whispered she had slipped on the icy bridge and fallen into the stream. Others suggested a sudden illness or perhaps, though said with lowered voices, a scandal. Miss Hartnell, always eager for drama, insisted she had seen a stranger asking for directions near the post office the previous evening. But Miss Marple, sitting quietly by her hearth with her knitting untouched, found her thoughts circling, not around strangers, but the letter left on her table, bearing her name in Mrs. Finch's careful hand. She opened it slowly. Inside were only a few words, written in haste. Something is wrong. If I am not back by nightfall, please tell the vicar. He must look in the red box. Miss Marple stared at the note for a long moment, then folded it neatly and placed it beside her cup. The snow outside thickened into a veil, and through it, the faint sound of church bells carried across the quiet fields. Whatever had happened to Mary Finch? It was no simple accident. Miss Marple knew from long experience that evil often arrived in the most ordinary of disguises. The note lay like a chill upon Miss Marple's tea table, a small square of alarm folded into neatness. She read it twice, tucked it into her reticule, and rose. Outside, snow hushed Mary Mead to winter industry. Each step toward the vicarage was a measured thought. Griselda opened at once, flower on her cuff, anxiety in her eyes. "Jane, you've heard?" "I have," Miss Marple said. "Leonard, if you please." The vicar came promptly. He read the note as Miss Marple had done twice. "The red box," he murmured. "Mary keeps a painted cash box at the post office. But she would never ask me. She would if not asking were worse. Might we go before the police make everything official and the village makes everything fanciful?" They crossed the green, snow whispering at their hems. Sergeant Lake from Much Benham looked up behind the counter. "Good afternoon, Vicar. Ma'am, we're taking statements about Mrs. Finch's last delivery." "The red box, if you please," Miss Marple said. "That's evidence," Lake objected. "So we must treat it as such," she agreed. The box emerged from a cupboard. "Mrs. Finch wore the key on a chain," Lake said. "Not at the cottage." Miss Marple slipped a knitting needle from her sleeve. With patient fingers, she found the catch. The lock yielded. Inside lay a ledger, accounts, and a bundle of envelopes tied with blue ribbon, each marked in pencil with an initial and a date. Beneath these sat a square parcel wrapped in brown paper and red string, unaddressed and hidden. Lake unwrapped it carefully. A tin of toffees appeared. Miss Pottle's brand. Its lid weighted. The weight proved a pocket diary, such as shopkeepers give at Christmas. Several pages were blank. Others were written in Mary's precise hand. "Appointments and dates," Lake said. "Here, Tuesday. Message for CM. Colonel Melchett," the vicar suggested. "He's vexed about a missing parcel." "Or Mrs. Caroline March," Miss Marple said mildly. "She adores secrecy rather more than secrets." Lake turned pages. 7:15. A upset. Wants letter back. Late man with muffler. Urgent telegram. And put key under mat. 10 minutes only. Griselda shivered. "That sounds exactly like trouble." "It sounds," Miss Marple replied, "like a conscientious woman pulled by opposing obligations." They recorded the discovery, replaced the items, and relocked the box. Miss Marple proposed a detour to Mr. Pottle's. The grocer confessed he had sold 2 identical toffee tins yesterday, one to Mary Finch, one to Mrs. Caroline March. "For a hamper," he said, and she winked. In the lane, Miss Marple paused. "Leonard, who sees to the church alcoves before the pageant." "The verger," he said. "Then there is where a cautious person might hide what she hopes will be safely overlooked. Cleanliness keeps secrets very well." The verger produced keys. They searched the choir stalls, vestry. Miss Marple's finger traced a dull strip along polished panelling behind the nativity backdrop. "Where polish fails," she observed, "fingers have been." A loose board lifted to reveal a narrow niche. No tin lay there, but a woolen scarf, damp, sour, and smelling faintly of tobacco. It was tied in a complacent, recognizable knot. "The colonel's muffler," the vicar said. "People lose hats," Miss Marple said. "They do not mislay habits. That knot belongs to him in the way a handwriting belongs to a writer. And yet I wonder if this is a gift left for discovery. One seldom abandons a calling card unless one intends it to be read." Lake folded the scarf into a paper bag. Miss Marple's steps slowed near the lich gate as they left. "Mary wrote to me. That suggests she feared official solutions more than village scrutiny. Who among us could frighten a scrupulous woman into bending rules? Someone she served," the vicar said. "Someone who understood the post." "Or someone," Miss Marple said, "who understood Mary." Back at the cottage, she drew the note and considered its phrasing. "If I am not back by nightfall," she repeated. Nightfall is not a clock, but a boundary. Mary was signaling that someone else kept the clock. "We'll speak to Colonel Melchett and to Mrs. March," Lake said. "I'll look at telegram records." "Yes, and if you please, at Arthur Hewitt, the butcher's boy. Errands see more than sermons. Ask him who visited Mary after 5. Griselda touched Miss Marple's hand. "Do you think Mary is—" "I think," Miss Marple said, "that a woman who parcels a diary and toffee and leaves a colonel's scarf in a cradle is appealing to the language the village understands. She wants us to look where piety and habit meet." Somewhere a fox crossed the green, leaving quick hieroglyphs in powder, and within the village hearts, unease settled like ash, waiting for the next small disturbance. Evening had fallen over. Mary Mead, its quiet lanes softened by snow that now lay several inches thick. Windows glowed with lamplight, and faint strains of laughter rose from the Blue Boar, where villagers gathered to trade theories about the vanished postmistress. Miss Marple, however, had no patience for idle speculation. She sat in her sitting room, knitting untouched once again, her eyes fixed on the flickering hearth as her mind turned over every detail of the day. The red box, the diary, the colonel's muffler, each told a fragment of a story, but none yet revealed the teller. She knew human behavior better than most. Patterns of guilt were often wrapped in habits of politeness, and Mary Finch, the tidy, reliable woman, had been a creature of habit, if ever there was one. For her to vanish, leaving breakfast unfinished, and a letter half-written, suggested not fear, but urgency, an obligation too important to ignore. At precisely 6 o'clock, the sound of brisk knocking came. The vicar stood at her door, snow-dusting his hat. "Jane," he said, voice low, "Colonel Melchett insists on seeing you," he said, well, rather agitated. "Agitated men," Miss Marple said gently, reaching for her shawl, "often say more than calm one." The colonel was pacing before the fire in the vicarage drawing-room when they arrived. His ruddy complexion was deeper than usual, and his voice carried the clipped irritation of a man accused before being questioned. "This is intolerable, Leonard. I've had that blasted Sergeant Lake insinuating that I might have lost my scarf near the church. The woman disappears, and suddenly I'm treated like a suspect." Miss Marple's eyes softened, though her tone was mild. "You were quite fond of Mrs. Finch, were you not, Colonel?" "Fond? Good heavens, no. Competent woman, of course, but tiresome as a clock, always reminding me about overdue parcels. Still, no reason for her to vanish." "Quite," Miss Marple said. "And the scarf?" He cleared his throat. I gave it to her last week. She'd mentioned how draughty the post office was. Thought she might wear it on her rounds." "She must have dropped it." Miss Marple nodded, though she noticed the vicar's faint frown. The colonel, as every woman in Merrymead knew, disliked the cold fiercely, and was never without that particular scarf in winter, yet she said nothing. As they left the vicarage, the snow had ceased, and a cold moonlight spread across the rooftops. Miss Marple paused on the path. "Leonard," she said softly, "I wonder if you might ask Mrs. Price Ridley to call tomorrow. She hears more than most, and forgets nothing. There's a curious pattern in this business, one that begins with gossip and ends with silence." The next morning, the village awoke to another surprise. Tommy Hewitt, the butcher's boy, had found a satchel buried behind the hedgerow near Mrs. Finch's cottage. Inside were letters, scores of them, never delivered. They were old, dating back months, even years. Sergeant Lake stood over the table at the post office, frowning as the envelopes were sorted. Some were open, some sealed. One, however, drew particular attention, addressed to Mr. Alfred Pottle, the grocer, with the flap unsealed and the contents missing. Miss Marple arrived quietly, as was her way. "A pity," she murmured, looking over the letters, "that such a tidy woman should leave her duties so disorderly. Unless, of course, someone else wished it to appear so." Lake's eyes narrowed. Meaning, she said, "that letters reveal more about people than they ever realize." "Tell me, Sergeant, who collects the outgoing post each evening?" "Tommy Hewitt again," he said. "Same boy who found the satchel." Miss Marple nodded. Then perhaps he's found too much or been told too little. By afternoon she was seated in her parlor once more, with Tommy across from her, clutching his cap. His eyes darted from the fire to the door. "I didn't take nothing, miss," he began. "I just saw her, Mrs. Finch, yesterday morning. She gave me a note, said to post it in Much Benham myself. Only when I got there, the clerk said it weren't addressed proper, so he couldn't send it. Do you still have it?" Miss Marple asked softly. He reached into his pocket and handed her a small folded page. It was blank, no name, no address, just a single sentence scrawled in hurried ink. "He knows about the letter. Keep it safe." Miss Marple's eyes moved slowly across the page, then back to the boy. Did you see anyone near her cottage after that? Tommy hesitated. A man, ma'am. Dark coat, muffler up high. He was standing by the gate when I left. Thought it was Colonel Melchett, till he turned away. Miss Marple folded the paper neatly. Thank you, Tommy. That will do. When he had gone, she sat motionless, the room silent save for the clock's ticking. A muffler again. A letter gone missing. And Mary Finch's warning about something wrong. Slowly the threads began to twist together in her mind. By evening, she walked to the church once more, the air sharp and still. Snow glittered under the lanterns, and the nativity scene stood solemn in the yard. She approached the vestry door, key borrowed from the verger earlier that afternoon. Inside the air was cold, the scent of wax faint. She lit a single candle and moved toward the alcove where the muffler had been found. Her eyes caught something new, a faint scuff mark on the wooden floor, half buried in dust. She crouched, brushing it gently. A footprint, smaller than a man's. Women's shoes, she murmured, and a hurried step. So she came here after all. The candle flame flickered, and for a moment Miss Marple thought she heard the faintest sound, a rustle near the back pews. But when she turned, only shadows met her gaze. Still, as she stepped outside into the cold, she knew the truth was drawing closer. Mary Finch had not vanished into the snow by chance. Someone had made sure her disappearance would keep a secret buried, and Miss Marple with quiet certainty was beginning to unearth it. The next morning dawned grey and still, with frost webbing the hedges and the scent of chimney smoke curling through the air. Miss Marple rose early, her mind busy with the fragments that had gathered overnight. Mary Finch had left a note, hidden a diary and written to her in haste, each act deliberate, each connected to that one phrase, "He knows about the letter." But what letter, and why had it frightened her so? By 9:30, Miss Marple was walking to the grocer's. Mr. Alfred Pottle, a stout man with a red face and an air of perpetual suspicion, was arranging tins of plum pudding in his window. He looked up when she entered. "Morning, Miss Marple. Dreadful business this. I suppose they'll be saying next that she ran off with someone." "I hardly think so," she said pleasantly. Mrs. Finch was not the sort for dramatic departures. "Speaking of her, I came across something curious. A letter addressed to you among others in that satchel the police found." Pottle's eyes darted away. "Oh, well, I never got it. If I had, I'd have said so." "I'm sure you would," Miss Marple replied gently. "Do you recall what business she might have had with you lately?" "Business?" He laughed uneasily. "Just the Christmas accounts. She handled my postal orders, that's all. Nothing worth fussing about." Miss Marple nodded. "Of course. Though one wonders why a woman so meticulous would keep your letter unposted, unless its content might have caused her some difficulty." Pottle stiffened. "Are you suggesting?" "I suggest nothing, Mr. Pottle. Merely observing, as one does. I do hope, however, that the missing contents weren't of a confidential nature." He muttered something about idle gossip and turned away, busying himself with his display. Miss Marple thanked him kindly and left, her suspicions quietly confirmed. A man who felt no guilt would not be so eager to end a conversation. On her way home, she stopped by the vicarage. "Leonard," she said, as the vicar set aside his sermon notes, "I believe Mrs. Finch stumbled upon something not meant for her eyes, a secret contained in a letter. The question is whether she meant to protect someone or expose them." The vicar frowned. But who could she have been protecting? Perhaps someone she trusted. Perhaps someone she feared. That evening, Sergeant Lake called with an update. "We've traced the handwriting from that note found with the boy. It matches the missing diary. But there's more. Someone was seen near the church vestry late last night." "Indeed," Miss Marple said softly. "That would not surprise me." The guilty often return to the scene, not from bravado, but from fear that something was left behind. As the clock struck 8, Miss Marple sat by her window once more, the snow gleaming pale beneath the lamplight. Somewhere in Mary Mead, a secret was beginning to unravel, and she intended to be waiting when it did. The following day brought a crisp wind that swept away the morning fog, revealing the village in sharp silvery light. The disappearance of Mary Finch had turned from whispered gossip to a full-blown obsession. In the post office doorway, Miss Price Ridley held court, insisting she had seen a light flickering in the postmistress's cottage at midnight, while Mr. Clement's gardener swore he'd heard voices near the bridge. But Miss Marple, ever serene, listened to these tales with the faintest of smiles. Villagers often mistook noise for meaning. The truth, she knew, was quieter. She decided to pay a visit to Mrs. Caroline March that afternoon. The woman lived in a neat Georgian house just beyond the churchyard, a widow with pale eyes and a tendency to know more than she ought. When Miss Marple arrived, Miss March was seated by the fire, dressed impeccably in grey silk, her expression faintly defensive. "My dear Miss Marple," she said sweetly, "how terrible about poor Mrs. Finch. I can't imagine what possessed her to disappear like that." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, taking a seat, "though one might imagine it was not possession but persuasion. Tell me, Mrs. March, had you any dealings with her recently?" Mrs. March hesitated, fingers tightening on her teacup. "Only a small matter of correspondence. She delivered a letter for me yesterday morning. Perfectly routine." Miss Marple's eyes, blue and calm, observed the woman's trembling hand. "Routine things," she said gently, "often lead to irregular outcomes." "I beg your pardon?" "Oh, nothing," Miss Marple said, smiling faintly. "Merely that Mrs. Finch seemed uneasy of late, as though she'd come across something that disturbed her sense of order." Mrs. March's lips parted, then pressed shut. "She was a worrier," she said finally, "always fretting about details. If she's wandered off, I dare say it's from nerves." Miss Marple rose. "Perhaps. Still, if she should write to you, or if you recall anything she mentioned, do let me know. Even the smallest remark may prove large in the end." Outside, the air bit sharply at Miss Marple's cheeks. She paused at the gate and glanced back toward the drawing-room window. Mrs. March stood there, half concealed by the curtain, watching her go. That, Miss Marple thought, was a curious habit for a woman with nothing to hide. When she returned home, she found Sergeant Lake waiting, cap in hand. "We've found something else, ma'am," he said gravely. "Under the bridge, near the mill stream. A handbag. Hers, we think. It's empty, but there's a trace of wax on the lining, as if a candle had been inside." "A candle," Miss Marple murmured. "So she brought light to where none was meant to shine." Lake frowned. "You think she went to meet someone?" "Oh, I'm sure she did," Miss Marple said softly, gazing toward the church spire glinting in the cold sun. "But whether she walked there of her own will or another's persuasion is what we must now discover." That evening, Miss Marple sat in her parlour, with the vicar and his wife, a teapot between them and the fire burning low. Griselda was pale with excitement, insisting that the handbag proved murder, while the vicar, ever cautious, urged patience. Miss Marple, however, remained thoughtful. The wax inside the handbag had stirred something in her mind, something faintly remembered from a Christmas past, when the choir had rehearsed by candlelight, and Mary Finch had complained of melted wax ruining her gloves. The image connected itself to another, the diary, the red box, the mention of a telegram. Slowly a picture was forming. "Leonard," she said at last, "you keep a record of parish donations, do you not?" "Of course," he said, puzzled. "Why?" "Because I think Mrs. Finch discovered something connected, not with her post, but with her parish. She was a woman who lived by rules, postal regulations, church duties, moral codes. To break one of those must have been for her a matter of conscience." Griselda leaned forward. "You think someone at the church was involved?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "Someone using the church, perhaps. a building with many quiet corners and too much trust. The next morning, she called at the church again, ostensibly to speak with the verger about the Christmas decorations. Inside, the air was cold and smelled faintly of polish and candle grease. She noted the traces of footprints still visible in the dust of the vestry floor, one small, one heavier, and knelt to examine them. The heavier one had a tiny indentation near the heel, like a boot with a missing nail. She smiled slightly. "That will be Sergeant Lake's, I imagine." But the other, the verger, approached, wiping his hands. "Oh, Miss Marple, dreadful business, isn't it? I'll be glad when the pageant's done. Half the village wandering in and out, pretending to help." "Indeed," she said mildly. "Tell me, Mr. Collins, who had keys to the vestry apart from yourself?" "Only the vicar, Mrs. Finch, for collecting the parish letters, and Mrs. March, of course, for the flower arrangements. She's particular about her lilies." "Ah, lilies," Miss Marple murmured. "A flower that fades quickly when cut, much like truth when it's tampered with." That evening, Miss Marple returned home and sat before the fire. She placed the note from Mary Finch beside her, and studied it anew. Tell the vicar. He must look in the red box. The red box had contained the diary and the parcel, but perhaps the real message had not been about its contents at all. Perhaps it had been about its color. Red for the post office, yes, but also red for warning. A knock startled her from her thoughts. Sergeant Lake stood there, snow in his hair, a grave expression on his face. "They've found something at the edge of the woods, ma'am," he said quietly. "A bicycle, Mrs. Finch's. It's half buried under the snow." Miss Marple rose at once, her knitting falling forgotten to the floor. Then, she said softly, "The truth has begun to surface. The bicycle was found where the lane curved sharply toward the old mill road, half hidden beneath a tangle of brambles and drifted snow." Miss Marple stood beside Sergeant Lake, her breath forming pale clouds in the icy air. The bicycle itself bore no damage, its tires intact, its chain oiled. It had not been cast aside in panic, it had been placed. That to Miss Marple was telling. People in distress did not tidy their exit. Lake crouched, brushing frost from the handlebars. "No footprints left now," he said grimly. "Snow covered everything overnight, but she must have come this way." "Or been brought," Miss Marple murmured. "A tidy scene often conceals untidy motives." Lake frowned. "You think someone moved it here deliberately?" "I think," she said quietly, "that someone wished us to look in the wrong direction." As they walked back toward the village, the faint chime of church bells drifted through the air, an oddly cheerful sound in such grim weather. Miss Marple stopped suddenly, eyes narrowing. "Sergeant, who arranged for those bells to be rung this morning?" "The verger, I suppose. He said it was practice for the Christmas service." "Practice? Yes," Miss Marple murmured. "But Mrs. Finch's bicycle lies within earshot of those bells. Curious, is it not, that she should vanish near a place where sound carries so far, yet no one heard a cry." By late afternoon, the village buzzed again. Colonel Melchett had stormed into the Blue Boar declaring his innocence for the third time, while Mrs. Price Ridley insisted she'd seen a tall man in a dark coat near the woods the previous night. Miss Marple, however, took tea with Griselda in calm silence until she said softly, "Leonard must visit Mrs. March again tomorrow. There's something she has not told us, and she is not the sort of woman who forgets details by accident." That evening, as snow began once more to fall, Miss Marple found herself drawn to Mary Finch's cottage. It had remained locked since the investigation began, but Sergeant Lake, after some persuasion, agreed to accompany her. Inside, the air was cold and stale, and the half-eaten breakfast still sat upon the table. Miss Marple moved slowly about the room, her eyes taking in the smallest things: the turned-back curtain, the book left open to a page about the Nativity, the faint scorch mark upon the window-sill. "She lit a candle here," Miss Marple said. "But for what? There's no reason to do so in daylight." Lake looked uncertain. "Signal, perhaps." Yes, Miss Marple said softly. But to whom? She bent down, then noticing a faint indentation in the rug near the chair. Something heavy had stood there once, something recently removed. She brushed her fingers lightly over the mark, feeling the outline. A box, she murmured. About this size. Not the red one, but similar. Lake straightened. You think she hid another? Miss Marple's expression was grave. Not hid, Sergeant. Delivered. Outside, the wind rose and carried the sound of bells again, soft, distant, echoing through the night like a warning, unheeded. The next morning, Miss Marple woke early, her mind sharpened by unease. There was something about that scorch mark, that missing box, and the faint ring of bells that tied everything together like a string drawn too tight. She dressed, wrapped her shawl, and stepped into the cold morning air. The snow had turned brittle overnight, crunching underfoot as she made her way toward the church. Sergeant Lake was already there, speaking with the verger, Mr. Collins, whose nervousness seemed to have grown overnight. He wrung his hands repeatedly, avoiding Miss Marple's gaze. It's dreadful, Miss Marple. Simply dreadful. I can't sleep for thinking of poor Mrs. Finch, always so kind, never missed a Sunday. Indeed, Miss Marple said mildly, and yet you seem quite troubled. Is there something you've not mentioned? Collins flushed. No, nothing at all. Only, well, last week she did come to the church after hours. Said she needed to leave a note for the vicar. I let her in, of course, but she was different. Frightened. Did she have anything with her? He hesitated. A parcel, about the size of a loaf, wrapped in brown paper. Said it was for the vicar's study. Lake frowned. There was no parcel in the vicarage when we searched. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. No, because it was never meant to reach him. She thanked the verger and stepped into the nave. The morning light spilled across the pews, pale and cold. She moved toward the altar, then stopped at the side door that led to the vicar's study. The handle was polished smooth, too smooth for winter. Someone had been there recently. She turned it slowly and entered. The small room smelled faintly of beeswax and old paper. On the desk sat a Bible and a brass candlestick, ordinary objects yet arranged with peculiar precision. She noticed wax drippings that ran not down the candle, but sideways, as though it had been tilted. A faint burn mark scarred the desk beneath it. She lit a candle here, Miss Marple said quietly. Not for prayer, but for proof. Lake looked puzzled. Proof of what? Miss Marple traced the burn with her fingertip. Proof that someone had been opening letters by heat. Wax leaves no stain when melted carefully, but a nervous hand leaves traces. The sergeant's face paled. Tampering with mail. Illegal. Indeed, Miss Marple said, and dangerous when the letters concern the private affairs of villagers. Someone was reading their secrets, perhaps to use them. As they left the study, Miss Marple paused at the vestry door. Tell me, Sergeant, has Mrs. March been informed about the bicycle?
Yes, ma'am.
She seemed, well, oddly relieved. Ah, Miss Marple murmured, her gaze distant. Relief is rarely an innocent emotion. It means the danger one feared has passed, or that someone else now bears it. The wind rattled the stained glass windows, and the church fell silent again. Somewhere in that silence, Miss Marple knew the answer was already waiting, patient, precise, and deadly calm. By late afternoon, the snow had turned to a fine drizzle that veiled the village in mist. The roads glistened and smoke from cottage chimneys rose in languid curls. Miss Marple sat at her window, staring at the faint light of the church tower beyond the trees. The pattern was taking shape in her mind. Mary Finch's letter, the hidden diary, the scorch marks, and the mysterious parcel that had never reached the vicar. Each detail pointed toward someone who understood the postmistress's duties all too well and had used them to conceal something dangerous. When Sergeant Lake arrived, his boots damp and his expression weary, Miss Marple poured him tea without a word. "You've news," she said, reading it in his eyes. He nodded. "We've questioned Mrs. March again. She admitted she sent a letter through Mrs. Finch, one she didn't want her servant to see. But she swears it was only about a debt, something to do with a loan from Mr. Pottle. She says Mary never delivered it." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "And yet, Mrs. March was the one who bought that second toffee tin, the same kind Mary hid the diary in. Don't you find that curious, Sergeant?" Lake blinked. "You mean the diary wasn't meant for us to find?" "Precisely. Mary Finch was clever. She made it appear as though she left a clue when in truth she hid one. She wanted her message to reach the right person, but not before her killer acted." Lake frowned. "Then the killer must have known about the diary." "Or about what it contained," Miss Marple replied softly. "You see, I believe Mary discovered that someone was intercepting private letters, opening them, resealing them, and learning things best left unknown. A tidy business for blackmail, don't you think? And who better to spot it than the postmistress herself?" The sergeant's face darkened. "You think Pottle has the temperament but not the subtlety?" Miss Marple interrupted gently. "No, Sergeant. This was someone who understood appearances, who could hide guilt behind refinement. A woman, perhaps, who used the church and the vicar's trust to her advantage. One who would have reason to fear exposure. Mrs. March." Lake leaned forward. "You're saying Miss Marple nodded. "Mary must have confronted her. Perhaps she hinted she'd tell the vicar. Mrs. March promised to meet her near the vestry under the guise of returning a parcel, and then silenced her. The candle wax, the scorch marks, the missing parcel. It all fits. Mary brought a letter as proof, and Mrs. March destroyed it. But she made one mistake. She left her scent, lilies. I smelled them in the study. Lilies were her signature, not Mary's." Lake exhaled. "So you think the body will be near water," Miss Marple said softly. "Somewhere close to the church, where the snow was thickest and the bells were loud enough to hide any sound." Outside the mist thickened, swallowing the last of the light. "Come, Sergeant," Miss Marple said, rising and reaching for her shawl. "It's time we looked beneath the bridge." The night had fallen heavy and wet, the drizzle turning to a low, icy fog that clung to every hedge and gravestone. Miss Marple walked carefully beside Sergeant Lake, her lantern's small flame trembling in the cold wind. The path toward the bridge was narrow, the snow melted to slick patches of mud. From somewhere beyond the trees came the slow murmur of water, steady and secretive. "Careful there, ma'am," Lake said as they reached the edge. "The stones are slick." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes fixed on the black surface of the stream. "If I were to hide a thing, Sergeant," she said softly, "I would choose a place that promises to wash away guilt yet never quite succeeds." They lowered the lantern, and its light flickered across the current. A faint glimmer caught Lake's eye. He climbed down carefully, boots sinking into the bank. "Something's wedged against the stones here," he called. A moment later, he emerged, soaked to the knees, holding a sodden bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Miss Marple's hands trembled slightly as she unwrapped it. Inside lay Mary Finch's handbag, this time not empty. Folded papers, tied with faded ribbon, and a small leather-bound notebook lay within. The top page bore a name in clear handwriting, Caroline Marple. Lake let out a low whistle. Her diary. Miss Marple's face was grave. No. Mary's record. She must have copied certain letters before returning them. Insurance against discovery. Lake scanned the pages quickly. Good heavens. There are transcripts of personal letters, loans, even one from the colonel about his niece's inheritance. And here, Mrs. March. Payments to a name. I don't know. A Pottle. Miss Marple's expression didn't change. Mrs. March was borrowing from the grocer to cover debts, and when Mary discovered the misuse of postal funds to conceal it, she confronted her. Mrs. March must have realized exposure would ruin her, so she arranged a meeting at the vestry, brought a candle to read the proof, and struck Mary in panic when she refused to stay silent. The sergeant swallowed hard, and afterward, she hid the body under the bridge until she could move it. But the snow came too quickly. Her plan failed the moment she tried to make it neat. From the darkness beyond the river, a sound broke, a soft sob. Lake swung his lantern. Mrs. March stood on the path, her silk cloak soaked through, eyes glistening. "You think you know everything, Miss Marple," she said hoarsely, "but you don't know what it's like to be cornered, to see ruin staring you in the face." Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "My dear, I know only that wrong done in fear is still wrong." Mrs. March took a step forward, then sagged. The fight leaving her. "She said she'd forgive me," she whispered. "She said she only wanted to make it right." Then Miss Marple said softly, "Perhaps she has." The next morning, the church bells tolled low and slow. Mary Mead returned to its quiet routines, the snow falling again as though to cover what had passed. Miss Marple sat by her window, her knitting finally in hand, and thought, not of guilt, nor of punishment, but of how easily kindness can perish when pride takes its place. The Christmas morning that followed was strangely subdued. The bells of Mary Mead rang out, not with their usual cheer, but with a muted solemnity that seemed to linger in the misty air. Villagers moved softly through the lanes, speaking in hushed tones as though unwilling to disturb the peace that had settled after the storm. The mystery of Mary Finch's disappearance had been laid bare. And yet, as Miss Marple well knew, the ending of a case rarely ended the unrest it caused. At the vicarage, Griselda poured tea with uncharacteristic quietness, while her husband scanned the morning paper. "They're saying Mrs. March will be taken to London for trial," she said finally. "It feels so dreadful, especially now, with Christmas here." Miss Marple, sitting near the hearth, nodded gently. "It is dreadful, my dear, but there's a kind of mercy in truth, even when it arrives wrapped in sorrow. Mrs. Finch gave her life not out of folly, but from decency. She believed right should remain right, no matter the cost." Griselda sighed. "I suppose the village will never be quite the same." "Villages," said Miss Marple softly, "have long memories, but they also heal quickly when new gossip comes along. Soon Mrs. Price Ridley will be talking about Mrs. March's lace curtains instead of her crime." The vicar smiled faintly. "Human nature, Jane." "Precisely," Miss Marple replied. "In Mary Mead, it's always human nature." Later that afternoon, Miss Marple walked through the snow-covered churchyard. The sky was the color of pewter, and the holly wreaths upon the graves glistened with frost. She paused by the bridge where the handbag had been found, the water now running clear and swift beneath the ice. A small bunch of white lilies lay there, left, no doubt, by someone moved by pity. She stooped, straightened them slightly, and murmured, "Rest easy, dear Mary. Your conscience was clear, and that is more than most can claim." As she turned to leave, Sergeant Blake approached, hat in hand. "It's over, ma'am." Mrs. March confessed fully this morning, said she only meant to frighten Mrs. Finch, that the fall by the river was an accident. Miss Marple looked at him gravely. "Perhaps it was. Few murders begin as planned. Fear does the work of evil better than wickedness ever could." Lake nodded. "Still, you were right from the start. Without you, we'd have missed every clue." "How do you do it, if you don't mind my asking?" She smiled faintly. "Oh, it's quite simple, really. People are much alike everywhere, Sergeant. One sees the same natures repeat themselves in different guises. The trick is noticing when a good person begins behaving like a frightened one." He grinned. "You make it sound easy." "Nothing worth understanding ever is," Miss Marple said, with a twinkle. "Now, go home, Sergeant. I expect even a policeman deserves a warm pudding at Christmas." That evening, the village gathered for the candlelit service. The choir sang softly, their voices trembling like the flicker of the flames. and the scent of pine and wax filled the air. Miss Marple sat in her usual pew, her eyes fixed not on the altar but on the people, faces she knew so well. Mr. Pottle, red-nosed and penitent, Mrs. Price Ridley whispering despite the hymns, and the vicar, his words steady and kind, reminding them all that forgiveness, though painful, was the heart of faith. When the service ended, snow began to fall again, light as feathers. The villagers lingered outside, exchanging murmured blessings and gloved handshakes. Miss Marple stood quietly beneath the lit gate, the faint glow of the lantern lighting her face. Griselda joined her, slipping her arm through the old lady's. "You look content, Jane." "I am," she said softly. "Evil is seldom grand. It's usually small and frightened, like a cornered mouse. But goodness, quiet, steadfast goodness, always finds its way back to the light." They began their walk home through the falling snow, the sound of laughter echoing faintly from the pub, mingling with the bell. Behind them, the church windows glowed warm against the night, and somewhere deep in Miss Marple's heart there was peace, not triumph, not pride, but peace born of understanding. In the days that followed, life in Merry Mead resumed its ordinary rhythm. Letters once again arrived promptly, gossip resumed with renewed energy, and the vicar's cat returned to sleeping in the post office window. Only Miss Marple seemed unchanged, her eyes as sharp and kind as ever. When asked how she spent Christmas Day, she simply smiled and said, "In the company of human nature, my dear," which is always the most interesting mystery of all. The new year crept into Merry Mead beneath a pale winter sun, and though the snow still lay thick upon the hedgerows, the air had softened. The tragedy of Mary Finch's disappearance was already sliding into memory, though not quite gone. For every cheerful greeting exchanged in the lane, there was still a faint hush when her name was mentioned. Yet life, as it always does, carried on. The post office had reopened under a temporary clerk, the church bells rang brighter than before, and the scent of baking bread drifted once more from the grocer's window. Miss Marple, for her part, had returned to her quiet routines, her knitting, her morning letters, her afternoon walks, but those who knew her well could sense that her thoughts were still turning. She had spent a lifetime watching how good people faltered and how evil ones justified themselves, and this Christmas's sorrow had reminded her that both could wear the same polite smile. One afternoon she received an unexpected visitor, Sergeant Lake. He looked more relaxed than before, the burden of the case finally lifted, though a certain curiosity still lingered in his expression. "I wanted to thank you, ma'am," he said. "The superintendent's written to commend your assistance. They're calling Mrs. Finch's case the quietest storm in county history." Miss Marple smiled. "Storms, Sergeant, do not need thunder to do their work. Sometimes they arrive in silence, rearranging everything before one even notices." Lake chuckled. "That's true enough. Still, there's one thing that puzzles me. Mrs. March said she meant only to frighten Mrs. Finch, that she pushed her near the bridge in panic, then fled. But how did you know the body would be found there?" Miss Marple folded her hands. "Because fear doesn't carry people far. When a frightened person acts, they run not toward escape, but toward the nearest concealment. The bridge was both hidden and familiar, a place she'd passed daily on her way to church. Guilt, Sergeant, often chooses comfort over cleverness." He nodded, impressed, and after a few more pleasantries, he took his leave. As his figure vanished down the lane, Miss Marple watched the faint trail of his footprints vanish into the softening snow. Later that evening, she received a small parcel, hand-delivered by the vicar's wife. Inside was a folded note in neat, careful handwriting. "For Miss Marple, with gratitude and remembrance from the parish committee, in honor of Mary Finch." Beneath the note lay a delicate brooch in the shape of a snowdrop. Miss Marple turned it over in her hand, smiling faintly. "A snowdrop," she murmured, "a flower that blooms when all else sleeps. How appropriate." That night, The village gathered for the 12th night supper at the hall. Candles flickered, laughter filled the air, and the air smelled of roasted chestnuts and pine. The children performed a small pageant, and even the colonel, gruff as ever, managed to smile. Yet amid the merriment, there was a gentler undercurrent, an unspoken gratitude that the peace of Mary Mead had been restored. When Miss Marple was asked to speak, she rose modestly, her voice clear but gentle. "This Christmas reminded us all," she began, "how precious honesty is and how fragile. We mustn't think of what was lost, but of what remains, our trust in one another, and our duty to protect it." A quiet murmur of agreement followed. The villagers, humbled by the season's events, raised their glasses in memory of the postmistress, whose sense of right had cost her so dearly. For a brief moment, Mary Mead seemed to breathe as one, its gossip forgotten, its pride softened, its goodness reaffirmed. When the evening ended, Miss Marple walked home through the frosted lane, her steps light despite her age. Above her, the stars burned cold and bright, and the air was still, except for the distant sound of an owl calling from the wood. She paused at the gate of her cottage, looking back toward the village, the glow of hearths, the laughter spilling faintly through the windows, and smiled. Inside, she set the snowdrop brooch upon her mantle and drew her shawl around her shoulders. Her kettle began to whistle softly. As she poured her tea, she thought again of Mary Finch, honest, dutiful Mary, who had seen too much but acted out of conscience, not curiosity. It was, Miss Marple reflected, the finest quality of all, the courage to do right quietly. Outside, the snow began to fall again, slow, steady, and soundless. Mary Mead sat peacefully, wrapped in the calm that follows truth revealed. And Miss Marple, ever observant, sat by her window with her knitting, content to watch the world mend itself one small kindness at a time.